as a minister, as a devout Christian, one of the things that really, really has been troublesome, I mean, frankly, hurtful to me is that I don't see my white evangelical allies, or white evangelical Christians as allies in this movement. They're standing off to the side and frequently are very, very critical. So we have a situation where there are, frankly, a lot of folks who are atheist or agnostic or whatever, but they're aligned with us on the side of human rights. And so we embrace them, even if they don't have an understanding of Black history and all that, because they're standing on the same side as we are.
Life can be messy.
Life can be unpredictable.
But a whole lot of love.
And a little wine makes it all work.
This is Love and Jesus Juice. Hey, Paula.
Hey, Kirby.
What are we drinking?
All right. So we have got Easley Winery back for a second week, and we are loving supporting this winery, having them support us. They have lots of great wines. You guys go check them out. I hope you will. Like I said, as far as we know at the time of this recording, they are still just doing curbside service, but would you please go buy a bottle of this wine? Go buy a bottle of Reggae Red. Whatever you love, they have got it. And support.
If you're in the Midwest and you see them on the grocery store shelf, you can buy them there.
Yeah, absolutely. Support this winery.
So we are at part 2 of our conversation with Larry on a black man talked with a white couple about race.
Yes.
Last week was pretty intense.
Yep.
We're going to continue that intense conversation. There's a little bit of disagreement going on in this.
Yeah.
But we hope you're carrying away from this conversation a lens of how people that may be different than you go through life.
And I hope that you will just really listen with an open mind and open heart. Listen to both sides of the conversation, not because you have to agree with them, but just to get a perspective.
And if this is your first episode with Love and Jesus Juice, you may want to pause, go back and listen to last week's episode because it will make a lot more sense. So let's jump right into the middle of the conversation. So a lot of the conversation from the national media level, and I have never experienced it from men like you or from any acquaintance that I've ever had, but we get inundated by it from the national. And I even remember talking with my college roommate recently. I didn't know I was racist until I went to college, and they told me I was. Mm-hmm. If you are a white person, you have white privilege, and you explained it to us, and thank you for that. But there's systematic racism. You should have white guilt. Mm-hmm. You should have things that you need to give up. Mm-hmm. And I don't. What I want to know is, one, how do you feel about making white people feel that way? Mm-hmm. And I know you don't make them feel that way, but that messaging from the national organizations or alphabet soup of organizations that's out there, because I do feel like part of our issue, in setting Trump aside, but part of the issue is white people who don't think race on a daily basis are being told they're evil, and so it's bringing up defense mechanisms. Am I imagining that, or?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things there. No, I don't think you're imagining that, but I also think, so there's a book, for example, you may or may not have heard of it. It's called White Fragility.
I've heard of it recently, yes.
And I strongly encourage everyone to read that book, because you're going to hear a range of messages in society. One is, white folks, there's inherent systemic racism. Get over it. Just deal with it. So that's one kind of message. All the way to the other end, which says, these white liberals are trying to make you feel guilty about being white, right? And so you have this range. I try to approach it from the standpoint of, one, recognize what white privilege is, understand it, and then let's have a discussion about it, because ultimately the issues are going to have to be resolved at the interpersonal level, not messaging, whether it's from the media or whatever. It has to be really resolved at the interpersonal level. So I'll give two quick examples. One is personal and one is not. So I'm a big fan of Black Expo's outdoor concerts, right? Mm-hmm. So a few years ago, this is probably 4 years ago now, I'm at the outdoor concert. Friend of mine from church he's white. He's married to an African American woman. We go to get. It's hot out there, so we go to get some drinks. And as you might imagine, there's some. I should say non-alcoholic beverages. There's a heavy police presence and so on, and you can't go here, you can't go there. And so my friend looks at me. He's getting frustrated because of where we're not going. And what he literally says to me is, you know what? I'm going to exercise my white privilege and step over this line where I'm not supposed to go. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, great. I'll go with you. And in that sense, I literally felt safer because I was with him to do that, right? And so that's it. There's not necessarily a quote unquote guilt that comes with that, but a recognition that kind of thing exists. Right? This is what it is. The second example I'm going to give is shortly after the election in 2016. I'm an NPR junkie, right? I get most of my news from NPR. So they were interviewing this African American guy. He's in Appalachia, I think in Pennsylvania somewhere. He's married to a white woman. He's got, as far as we could tell, sort of pretty good relations with his in-laws. And so he's having a conversation, after the election. He's having a conversation with his brother-in-law, and the black guy is a little bit surprised that his brother-in-law voted for Donald Trump based upon the nature of their relationship. And so he asked him about this, and I can't remember this guy's name, but I will give him credit. What he says is, I voted for Donald Trump because I think that he is going to give my white boys a better chance at success. And I thought that was fascinating. This guy is stunned. But my point is this: if we strip away, being pro-life, all Republican presidents are pro-life. If we strip away, lower taxes, all Republican presidents are for lower taxes. That, from my perspective, is not what draws a lot of white Americans to Donald Trump. It is exactly what this man had the guts to admit. I think that he is going to make a better future for white Americans. That's what the guy said to the black guy, and the guy was like stunned. And so we in fact, I wrote about this in one of my columns. We have to be. I'm talking about when I say we, in this case, white Americans have to have the moral courage first to themselves to ask the question, why do I really support this man in spite of everything else, right? And wrestling with that. What I said is that he kind of causes people to hold up a mirror to themselves. Why would you support this man? And I'm speaking now specifically to white evangelical Christians. Why would you support a man whose personal life, and in many ways his professional life, is antithetical to literally everything that you say you believe?
That is a great question. May I answer it for you?
Please, go right ahead.
Okay. Since we're back around to politics, and I think we'll probably just try to not get too upset here and move forward. Because that question does come up a lot. And especially when you've got men like Ben Carson, who is a white evangelical, or not white. Sorry, misspeak.
I was going to say the last time I was black,
a black evangelical claiming that Trump is not racist, that he works with him on a regular basis, elbows deep in it. You've got Herschel Walker, who is a black evangelist, who says, I've known the man for 37 years, and he's not a racist. And you go back to the election of 2018. And I consider myself a white person, mentioned that, clear. I am evangelical Christian. Unabashedly so, and I voted for Donald Trump. But in the primary, after it was all sealed and done, I voted for Ben Carson because I was not going to vote for Donald Trump twice because I do not like the man. But morally, he's a faulty. He has his failings, but so does Hillary Clinton. Politically, I believed Hillary Clinton had more failings than Donald had politically. So it was easy as an evangelical to set aside the audio tapes and all the other stuff because I know for a fact Hillary is just as bad of an individual when you factor in all of the stuff that she did. So to me, I didn't have a good choice. I didn't have a candidate that my spiritual backing could say, I respect that person. And I said then the only person Donald Trump could beat was Hillary Clinton. And conversely, the only person Hillary Clinton was going to beat was a man like Donald Trump, which is why it was such a close race. They had Donald run against Barack Obama, he was going to lose. Had Hillary ran against Mitt Romney, she was going to lose. When you put a person who can perceive a higher moral ethic, we got George Bush II because of Clinton's failings in the White House as a human being, not necessarily what he did. I mean, matter of fact, he was a pretty lightweight Republican as a Democrat in the 8 years that he was there.
That's what Ralph Nader called him the most successful Republican.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, and I used to teach my kids that John F. Kennedy was a fabulous Republican president. Matter of fact, most of Kennedy's policies that he got through happened after he died because he had the martyr complex.
Yep.
As a Democrat, there's no way he got the Civil Rights Act of 1963 through that deep Democrat Congress.
Yeah.
If Lyndon Johnson had a choice, he wouldn't have pushed it through because he was a huge racist. But it was the martyrdom of John F. Kennedy that allowed the progress to go forward. So, and being a historian, I've gone through every single president. I'm currently on Howard Taft on my biographies. Every single one of them is morally flawed deep to their core if you want them to be. Yeah. And so from an evangelical standpoint, it isn't that I approve of. Yeah. And I'm appalled when I drive by one of the Black Lives Matters. They call them protests, but in Indiana, it seems like every time we drive by one, it's a bunch of white people at a courthouse. And so I'm not sure if they fully are having conversations like this and they're understanding or they're just doing it. But the point being is when they're on one corner and Trump supporters are on the other corner. Because I don't think that's what we should be doing. We're not comparing Make America Great Again to Black Lives Matter. I don't think those are opposite sides of a conversation. They shouldn't be opposite sides of the conversation. Black lives matter. All lives matter. Both of those are true. We need to be moving into the direction of a post-racial society, which may be a pipe dream. But the idea of making the United States economically strong, continuing to hold its place as a superpower in the world and a beacon to other democracies, I don't think that's a racist conversation. I think I'm proud to be an American is something we should say. Right. And we can be members of the world community without that being xenophobic. It's just a matter of this is the beacon to the world of democracy. It is the beacon to the world of a country that does face its mistakes. You don't see Germany waking up every day and going, let's go back and revisit all the mistakes we did in the 1930s. They try to bury it.
Well, so in Germany, I'm glad you mentioned the German example. So obviously there's a lot of debate here about Confederate flags and monuments and all that. I would be more than happy to leave the monuments in place if they did what they do in Germany, which is to say, so they'll put up plaques and so forth at Auschwitz and all the other concentration camps and say, this is what happened. It was horrible. It was terrible. Blah, blah. We don't do that with Confederate monuments here. We extol these folks. Whereas you would never see that in there. There are no. In fact, Robert E. Lee himself said, "Don't build any monuments to the Confederacy." And if you look at those monuments, most of them happened not right after the Civil War.
No, they were they were not. They were a 40s, 50s, 60s building. Yeah.
And I should have made this point earlier, and I apologize for that. But so my position to Donald Trump is not merely racism, xenophobia, et cetera, et cetera. It is fundamentally, for example, about economic policy. I mean, so for example, if tax cuts and supply side economics. Every time we have supply side economics, which is to say, tax cut Reaganomics, or as George Bush 41 says, voodoo economics, right? There's always an increase in the deficits, right? The only time that did not happen is, as you know, as a historian, was Kennedy. He passes his tax cut, but the highest marginal rate was like 90% at that point. So it spurs this economic growth. Where are the deficits today? How much have the deficits increased after these tax cuts, today? So I oppose him on economic grounds. I oppose him on a lot of grounds. When was the last time we had a surplus? We had a Democrat in the White House who raised taxes, right? Worked, he and Newt Gingrich did their thing, similar to Reagan and Tip O'Neill. But he cut some spending, and to your point, Clinton was a centrist. He was a blue dog Democrat, as we used to say. But he raised taxes. We had peace and prosperity. Right, and so for me, it's not mere. If you take away all the objectionable things that and his personal resume, if you will, his biography, put all that stuff aside. Isolationism as well. So we need to engage with the world. One of my criticisms of President Obama is Vladimir Putin perceived that he pulled back from the world, and so under George W. Bush, he goes into Soviet Georgia, former Soviet Georgia. Under Obama, he goes into Ukraine and so forth. So whenever America retreats from the world, our enemies sort of rise up. In particular, China and Russia. So for me, make America great, or America, not make America great, but America first has meant America alone. We have to be that light. For me, we have to be engaged in the world, not retreating from it.
Yeah, which I think is a fair point. I think what we're really discovering during all of this, and at least for you and I, is in many ways we're just shades on either side of the center. Yeah. And it's just a different perspective.
So let's go to Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's how can we not talk about that?
Absolutely.
So talk to me about what that means to you as a Black man when you see all these white people out there doing their thing. I guess it's like I grew up in the country and we wore flannel shirts and we made fun of other people that wore flannel shirts.
Yes, right.
And so I see white people and I'm like, do you even know what you're doing?
Yeah.
And maybe they do. I haven't had conversations with the people on Courthouse, so I don't know. But tell me your perspective on that.
Yeah, so first thing about Black Lives Matter is, and we've said it over and over and over again, it's literally never been only, right? The issue that we have is it's as if people pretend that we're saying only Black Lives Matter, which has literally never been the case. And also, I have to say, as a devout Christian, initially I was skeptical of Black Lives Matter, and this is the reason why. I perceived it to be, in many ways, very anti-church, anti-religion. If you look at the history of this country, almost every civil rights movement that has arisen in America has had its roots in the Black church.
Yes.
There are a couple of exceptions to that. One is Marcus Garvey with his UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican immigrant. This movement, which had as many as 1 million people estimated, did not start in the Black church. The other is the Nation of Islam, which is actually decidedly not a civil rights movement, but it was a mass movement that starts under Elijah Muhammad and then Malcolm X and now down to Louis Farrakhan. Those did not start in the Black church, but literally every other sort of movement of that nature starts in the Black church. Black Lives Matter was explicitly anti-church in the beginning, so I did not fully embrace it initially. A couple of the founders are Marxist, but the difference with BLM is that they literally are, as a kind of a traditional guy, the phrase that I would use is leaderless. The phrase that they would use is leaderful, meaning it's non-hierarchical.
Okay.
Right. That there is not, and so there are pros and cons to this. So, Dr. King's assassinated, the civil rights movement basically dies with him. Ralph Abernathy, his best friend, doesn't have the skills that he does. It basically dies with him, gives way to the Black Power movement. Black Lives Matter, realizing that history, and because they're millennials and Gen Z, says, okay, different thought process, different approach. We're not going to have the one leader syndrome. It's certainly not going to be a man. It's not hierarchical and not patriarchal and so on. So my point is, in some ways, Black Lives Matter is kind of a Rorschach test, kind of this ink blot test. When you look at it, what do you see? To your point about you go to some of the protests, it's definitely more whites than African Americans.
Right.
I go back to Charlottesville in 2017. I'm sitting here watching this unfold on TV, and I'm looking at these two different sides, and it's almost all white people literally fighting each other. And I'm stunned, right? I'm fascinated. And for me, at the end of the day, this is where, kind of Black Lives Matter starts with kind of, Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, and then kind of grows out from there. And today actually has a net positive perception, even among a slight majority of white Americans. But for me, it really comes down to two sides. On the one side, you had people, again, Richard Spencer was one of the organizers of the Unite the Right rally. You have on one side people with Nazi flags, Confederate flags, yelling racial slurs. Obviously, Heather Heyer was murdered, run over, on and on and on. On the other side, you have, Antifa, literally anti-fascists fighting them. And so for me, when people call them communists and this and that, I don't care what label they have. All I know is that they were fighting the people who would want to kill me, right? And so I am putting in my lot with that group of people. You know, and these movements, I think, need to be multiracial, because ultimately for me, it's not about, you know, black people against white people. It's about what is right against what is wrong. And so I'm going to invite as many allies as I can, irrespective of what race they are, to the extent that, and by the way, let me add this and I'll make my final point. And, you know, again, as a minister, as a devout Christian, one of the things that really, really has been troublesome, I mean, frankly, hurtful to me, is that I don't see my white evangelical allies, or white evangelical Christians, as allies in this movement. They're standing off to the side and frequently are very, very critical. So we have a situation where there are, frankly, a lot of folks who are atheists or agnostic or whatever, but they're aligned with us on the side of human rights. And so we embrace them, even if they don't have an understanding of Black history and all that, because they're standing on the same side as we are. So.
No, so come find out, even if you don't understand, come figure it out. Okay, that makes sense.
And I think one of the issues is, like, you talk about Black Lives Matter started out as a leaderless movement, but the organized BlackLivesMatter.com is a Marxist organization.
Yes. Well, it started by two Marxists, right?
But their about is still heavily focusing on words like comrade, and so it's a struggle for someone to go, okay, yes, I support Black Lives Matters. No, I don't support Black Lives Matter, because I've read through the about, I've been on the website, I've educated myself about that. There's nothing on there that I can support besides we wish it wasn't necessary. I think that's kind of an underlining message. Although even in that is, you know, we are unabashedly Black and we are a Black brotherhood, which in and of itself is divisive versus we are a humanity. But I get that. So to me, that's kind of one of the struggle is, we are seeing this hijacking of what could be a transformational movement. Everybody was upset by George Floyd. Nobody saw that and didn't say, we got to do something. We got to fix something. To a hijacking of politicizing it and destroying and burning and 90 days straight in Portland and defunding the police, and rather than saying, wait a minute, how do we take a situation that comes down and immediately pause and go, what went wrong and how do we fix that?
Yeah. So here's what I would say to that. There has never, and I want to say this very, very carefully, there has never been a quote unquote civil rights movement in the history of America that a majority of whites have agreed with, right? Not one, right? So that's point number one. Point number two is and I know a lot of people are upset today, looting, but you mentioned Portland and so on. But when Colin Kaepernick had a peaceful protest, white folks still went crazy, right? And you had people who, this incongruity always just is mind-boggling to me. You have people literally waving the Confederate flag, calling him anti-American. You know, the people who literally took up arms against America, calling him anti-American. So his peaceful protest did not bring about results. And so now you have Roger Goodell, president of the NFL, saying, you know what, I owe him an apology. We should have listened more. And so when I look at, or you look at, you know, Dr. King, April 4th, 1968, he's assassinated. April 3rd, and then he becomes a martyr immediately. April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King is one of the most hated men in America. He's against the Vietnam War. He's way ahead of everybody else in terms of the Vietnam. Loses a lot of support, even among African Americans. His advisors, Andrew Young, et cetera, said, you know, Martin, don't get involved in that. It takes us away from where we need to be. And yet, you know, of course, history has proven him to be correct. And so sometimes you have to be out front. Letter from a Birmingham jail.
That powerful document.
Yes, right. Well, how does it begin? He basically he's being critical of his fellow white Christians who are saying, now is not the time. This is imprudent to do. Let's wait. And as he says, you know, wait has always meant never. And so my point is simply this. From my perspective, it doesn't really matter whether the protests are peaceful or not. Because when they were still peaceful, we didn't have a majority of white Americans on our side. And so, as JFK said, when you make nonviolent revolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. That's JFK who says that, right? And so, and even again, there's a great article in the Atlantic magazine that kind of talks about the history of riots and protesting and so on. America was the seed of America was started in protest. In the Boston Massacre, right? I mean, so Crispus Attucks, the first man, to die, a black man to die for the American Revolution. Violent protest has always been transformational in this country. It's just that it's only, and this is what the Atlantic article talks about, it is only when African Americans engage in violent protest that it becomes a major problem.
Mm-hmm. It's so hard because I think there's a lot of us that want to be better. Mm-hmm. And so where does it start? Yeah. How do we start that? How do we start paying attention to the nonviolent protests? And I think that's not because I have a solution, but because I think it is part of the conversation.
And I think the unfortunate part is when I look at the videos from a lot of these big cities, I don't think it's the African American community doing the violent protesting as a whole. Yeah. I think there are African Americans in the protests or in the looting and in there. And immediately following some of these, absolutely. An unfortunate part is just like the 1993 riot, 92, the Rodney King riots, 92, they were destroying their own neighborhood. And that's, to me, I struggle with that.
Well, as Dr. King said, riots are what we call, riots, that is the cry of the unheard. So whereas he never explicitly endorses riots, he never explicitly condemns them either. And in terms of destroying their own neighborhoods, here's the thing. As soon as, African Americans step over a certain line, there's not going to be destroying any neighborhoods because they're going to be shot.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So what do you do with that frustration? Scientists have done experiments with rats, right, where you put them in confined spaces, et cetera, et cetera. You sort of recreate these social conditions. Well, what do rats do? They begin to kill each other, right? So when you're in some of these areas, even if we go back to Michael Brown, hands up, don't shoot, and even President Obama's Justice Department says, he clears Darren Wilson, Eric Holder clears Darren Wilson, but everyone knows that. But if you read the reports, the full report, it says that these riots are a result of years of what's going on with St. Louis and Ferguson. So even if you say, which I don't necessarily believe, but even if you say for the sake of argument, Michael Brown is completely guilty, he blah, 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 there's a history that goes along with that, right? And so, and even if you look, think about this, back to the police officers in St. Louis, there are two, did you know this? There are two police unions, one black and one white.
Which is, again, ridiculous. Makes no sense.
Because black officers and white, this is one phrase that I've often used. Even when black people and white people live in the same, reside in the same neighborhood, we live in different worlds, right? And that's why you have these two separate police unions based upon race in St. Louis.
Well, I think this has been a really good conversation. And I think I would like to just wrap up with two final segments.
Sure.
I would like from a white voice to speak to the black community. And then I would like you to speak from your heart to our community.
Tell us, and that's what I was going to say, tell us, what do we do?
But I also want to speak to my white community too. So I'm kind of, and so I kind of want you to speak to your black community too, because I think we have to speak both sides if we're going to get there. One, I think the Confederate flag is a ridiculously racist symbol. Always have. I used to teach my kids when I was a high school teacher. There is no other way. Right. Don't go me the states' rights argument. That was a cover. Yeah. Waving it. Now, should it be in museums? Absolutely. Yeah. It is part of our history. Agreed. I believe that the monuments to civil right or to Civil War, Confederate generals do not belong in public squares. Andrew Jackson, just because he owned slaves, when it was legal and was a president, shouldn't necessarily have his statue torn down at this point because we have faults everywhere. That's my opinion. I think we got to watch our history that's in there. But I believe that there is a very large population of white people that have no intention of ever being racist. Any racist innuendo they give, any racist message they give is simply from a lack of exposure. And I believe strongly it gets better with every generation. I know my grandparents said things that appalled me. And my parents and in-laws have said things where it's like, I don't you can say that. But yet these same people have poured their heart into inner city Indianapolis in missions, and they poured their heart into Haiti in missions. And so it's just generations of wiring. And I believe my children are better than I am. And my granddaughter is going to be better than them. And so I would ask that the Black community give us a chance to share with you our disdain, but also a way to move forward. Yeah. And I would say to my other white friends, listen to conversations like you've said and go, we don't have to feel guilty about who we are, but we can also do better about what we give.
Yeah, agree, completely with that. It is that it begins with an individual conversations. And so, Martin Luther King talked about the myth of time, which is to say that we always say, 30, 40, 50 years in the future, things will be better. And he says, no, it is only, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's only what we do in this time that determines what happens in the future. I take a lot of heat from other Black folk who think that I am essentially too open to white Americans. I'm an apologist for white behavior, which I obviously don't think that I am. And so, but we also have to, I understand that comes from, there's a woman named Dr. Joy DeGruy who's written a book called, and it's several years old now, but Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, similar to PTSD. And it basically means we are affected by trauma, right? So, and that is sort of handed down, because I know the stories that came from my mother and my grandmother and so on. And so we're affected by that. And some Black folk to say, well, I don't have anything to do with white people, period. Right? And I don't have to, because I live in this neighborhood. There are no white people here. They're not a part of my daily existence. And so for me, I try to talk to them and say, my experience when I was in corporate America was different. I got promotions, et cetera, et cetera. My experience with a lot of my friends was different. And so talking with them, I'm hopeful, and I think that I've brought a couple around. I have, again, by the same token, white friends who grew up on the south side of Indianapolis who think very, very differently from I do, but they feel comfortable enough to engage with me about what they disagree with, whether it's Black Lives Matter, et cetera, or why they support Donald Trump. And as long as people know that, I literally have never, quote unquote, unfriended anybody on Facebook because of a political belief. I'm not going to have a bunch of profanity and stuff on my page. But whether you are for the Republican, the Democrat, the Libertarian, the Green Party or whatever, that's fine, right? Let's talk about why you believe that way and why I agree or disagree, and the same with everyone else. So I really do think that there's a power in interpersonal relationships that social media distorts and gets us away from.
Right.
We have to have more of this. People, sitting down, as the Bible says, come let us reason together. And I think that's incredibly important.
Absolutely. And, I think just one other thing that I would love to know is, what do I do with this platform that I have? Like I have a huge following and I have a huge opportunity, and I believe that God gave that to me to use it. But my biggest concern is to be another voice that doesn't really know. So what do I do with that? How do I impact your community and my community?
I think continue to, first of all, to do what you do, but then also after COVID, getting people together in the same space and just talking. For a long time, I was a member of the Jewish Community Center has a group that is composed of African American and Jewish people, right? Who have a long history of cooperating, but also a long history of tension as well. The explicit purpose of that group is to bring together Blacks and Jews. I love it. Right. And have some very, very difficult discussions, right? And so I think similarly here, for me, there's no substitute for having people in a room, talking, and again, not always necessarily agreeing, but understanding, truly listening to each other and saying, this is why I believe what I do, this is why I feel the way I feel. And again, even if ultimately we don't agree, we could still, come together. And frankly, I do think that at some level, some of those disagreements will fall away.
I agree.
Once we have genuine dialogue.
I love it. Yeah. This is
Well,
awesome.
thank you again, Larry, for taking time out of your schedule. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah. This is huge.
I think it was everything we wanted it to be, and I hope it was a blessing for you at the same time. Okay. Wow.
It was a lot.
That was a lot. That was some intense conversation. Fabulous conversation.
I am so grateful that when you reached out to him, he said, sure, I'll have that conversation with you. I don't know if he had the apprehension that I had. And I said at the beginning of the first one, I was really apprehensive about it because I just didn't want to mess it up. Honestly, that was really where it is. And I don't like conflict,
right.
But I feel like it was such a great conversation, and there wasn't conflict for the sake of conflict. It was conflict for the sake of we don't agree on everything.
What I really love about Larry is he is okay with people who disagree with him.
Absolutely. And
he has a strong personality.
Yeah.
But it's okay.
It really is. And we're strong personalities. And so as I look back on this conversation, I know I'm always going to look back on this conversation as being a place where I really was able to see it through the eyes of someone else.
So what was your biggest takeaway?
It will be, and I said this during the podcast, when he said he would not buy his little boy a Nerf gun or a water gun, I was like, it just flipped in my brain in a whole different way. Now, I think, if they were out here in our backyard, would that be a little bit different? Potentially. But the reality is that that's what he considers. I don't know if it's what everybody considers, but what he considers white privilege. And it just gave me a different perspective on that. And so I'm really grateful for that. So what was it for you that really stuck with you?
I think, and a lot of this was kind of formulating in the hours immediately following the conversation, was realizing just the power of the lens that we have when we look at situations.
Totally.
We fall on slightly different sides of the political spectrum, but our base value systems were very similar. I think it's one of the reasons why I get along with him so well is our core value is the same. But those core values are viewed from my rural country, white, middle-class upbringing. His core values are viewed through more of an inner-city African-American point of view. And that's probably one of our biggest challenges right now. If you want to break this whole conversation down, is the lens that we start at.
Yeah.
When we see a situation like a George Floyd, although I don't know that there's a huge difference in that one. I think a lot of people are seeing that the same way. But a lot of these immediate aftermaths of a police shooting or something like that, or the value of the protests or whatever, our lens is dictating how we feel.
Yeah, and we've talked about a lot of times, when you're having a conversation with somebody, you use words that make sense to you based on your experience.
Right.
And so when you try to say the exact same thing to somebody else and ask them to speak back to you what they just heard, it's oftentimes very different. It's called communication.
Yeah.
Right? And so this was the ultimate in communication. And one of the things that I found so interesting is he's very into politics, just like you are. He loves that kind of thing. And so you guys really do have very different views. And I think it takes strong, mature people to be able to be that different and yet understand that we're all in the same team.
Right. So yeah, like when I hear about Trayvon Martin, for example, from years ago, my viewpoint was, I'm sure the white guy, the shooter, was scared. That's where I go.
Right.
Because it was late at night, it was 2:00 in the morning, nothing good happens after that. I don't know anybody that would go out to shoot somebody, a black man, at 2:00 in the morning. So my lens was,
right,
whatever happened, there was something that did that. His lens was, the black man probably was assumed to be doing something wrong.
Right.
Because that's his lens. And I came out of this going, you know what? That's the breakdown right there. My starting point is that the white guy is probably not wrong. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. His starting point is he's giving the black guy the benefit of the doubt.
Which you totally get. Both sides of it.
Both sides of it.
Like when you speak that out, you totally get that.
And the reality is every situation should be taken kind of insulated and go, okay, I don't know who's going to be right here. There's not enough data. There's not enough information. And whites need to be willing to go, okay, there are some people out there doing some bad things.
Absolutely.
Whether I would or not, or whether I think I would or not, there are people doing some bad things, and I have to be willing to accept that that's the truth. And the other side of it, what I heard from him was kind of the same thing, is I'm going to have to realize that maybe it's possible, but the experience is so inundated on us that we are rebounding to those decisions. And it's scary because I don't know I don't know that we came up through this conversation with beyond small groups sitting down and having a conversation going, can you feel me? Because I want to feel you. How do we get beyond this?
Well, and that was what I asked him. What do we do? I mean, how do we get through this? And it really is, what I heard him say is, it's the whisper, it's not the megaphone.
Right.
And so while putting something on Facebook or anything like that there's nothing wrong with it. But how are we really going to change the conversation? It's the three people sitting down and saying, tell me what to call you. Do I call you Black or do I call you African American? Why is something more offensive than the other? How did you see that? And just those conversations that we had. And I think if we will take the time to have more of those conversations. And to me, this is not just a black and white issue. This is a race. This is a diversity issue. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of places where we don't have those diversity conversations.
And I think you pointed that out. This can't be the last conversation.
Can't be.
There's other representatives of groups that we need to have a conversation with. We need to speak with a white and an African American police officer.
Yeah.
We need to go out and go, okay, what does it feel like? Because I do think I don't understand when the police officers are putting their uniform on, what's their feelings when they're leaving? And are those experiential? Are they value? Are they trained in?
Yeah.
Because that's how the training's got to start going, okay, if a cop is going in there somewhat, like Larry pointed out in the conversation, trigger happy, then we got to figure out why.
Yeah.
And how do we get beyond that? How do we overcome that? But at the same time, not take away their ability to defend themselves, because there are bad people out there.
And again, it's perspective. I would love to have that conversation with a couple of police officers, because again, where they're starting and where we're starting, I'm sure are different. And so making a judgment, I hope that I would never do that anyway, but I would love to just continue that conversation, because I'm sure there are perception issues that I have right now, just like I did with Larry, that I just couldn't, just not been there. I just couldn't understand it. And and I think Black women, and I think Hispanic, the whole Hispanic population. I mean, there's probably so many different conversations that we could be having about diversity that could help us all grow.
And if we get beyond a right or a wrong, or an opinion means racism, or lack thereof, because sometimes it's not even connected to that at all. There's political other things in there. And that conversation with Larry went very political on different parts of it. And again, I think it was the lens that he was bringing to the table that made him see it in a political viewpoint that I hadn't even seen it as a political issue yet.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, inside that political spectrum, we're seeing kind of a rehash where we're taking racial issues and people are forcing it in to, if I vote for him, I have to be racist. If I don't vote for him, to prove I'm not racist, I have to vote for him. And that's not what politics is about. Politics is about what's best for our country. What's your opinion?
Well, that's what politics should be about.
In my ideal little world, that's what I wanted.
I was going to say your view of what politics should be and what politics has become are two different things.
And we talk about takeaways, and I think that was probably one of the other things that came to the surface for me was I realized that I kind of had my head have continued to have my head in the sand because I don't want this to be an issue.
Right.
And so if I just pretend that most people are good or live in that outlook, which is a great and healthy way to do it, but it sometimes can be so over Pollyanna-ish that I kind of do forget that maybe there are more people out there that are still racist. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Right. And I think that's the biggest thing is we like to think we don't view the world that way. And I think for the most part, I think through conversation with him, I feel pretty confident about how I view it, but there was still a lack of knowledge. And so I'm grateful that he was willing to have the conversation and just be open and honest with us. And I really do hope that you all will share your takeaways, share your thoughts, share your questions. If you feel like there's another conversation that would be helpful for us to have, I would love to meet somebody talk to somebody, but my one request or my one stipulation would be that we have to be able to leave that conversation and understand that just because we don't agree doesn't mean we hate each other.
Right.
And I felt very confident that that's how we left that conversation.
I do. So please share these conversations. If this conversation meant something to you, if you got something out of it, this is the one. If there's an episode for you or episodes for you to share on your social media, this is it.
Absolutely.
Because the more people who can hear the reasonableness with which I think this conversation went on, even though there was some very clear disagreements, then more people can realize that this conversation can be had.
Absolutely. And support Easley Winery.
Support Easley Winery. We're so thankful for this as a sponsor. Would have loved to have done this as a live show if that COVID wasn't in our way.
Yes, absolutely. And check us out on social media.
Love and Jesus Juice on Facebook and Instagram, on our website, which is
loveandjesusjuice.com,
where you can sign up for a newsletter and you can buy Love and Jesus Juice merchandise to help support us and keep us on the air. Have a great week, and we will see you then.